Well, let's get into this. The first thing we're going to do is disconnect the spark plug so we don't have an accidental firing. Putting on gloves, we're going to tip the lawnmower up where the air filter is the highest point. That usually means the muffler right here is going to be facing the other way. If you have impact tools, it'd be great to use them. And this is a 9/16 bolt. And if it needs to be cleaned off, go ahead so that you don't strip it. There we go. Well, this particular engine doesn't have a drain plug in the bottom. So what we'll do is we'll remove the engine from the deck with 3 1/2-inch bolts and drain it out of the fill cap, just tipping it over when it's off the deck. Now, I've done this a couple of times to replace these mowers on these engines because they last a lot longer, like I said, than the decks. These are self-tapping screws. And very seldom do I ever get all of the screws out without having them break off into the bottom of this motor. But we'll give it a shot. So 3 bolts, 1/2-inch. What I find is that the motors far outlast the decks. Let me show you what I'm looking at here. It's a very thin deck, first off, and I normally see breakage right around the handle where it mounts. And then I believe this is planned obsolescence. All of these holes that are drilled so close in this thin metal, as on the other side, you're going to get a tear out somewhere in here. And people will do anything to rig it. I mean, they'll put boards, they'll tack it, but the decks usually are the first to go. So let's get into the motor. Before I drain the oil out of this dipstick, what I'm going to do is remove the brake cable. And that's a 1/4-inch bolt on the top here. Like so. And then to pull this out, you just remove these locking tabs. You got to squeeze them and they should come right out for you. Sometimes you got to play with it a little bit. Just like so. To drain the oil, just remove the dipstick. Yeah, it needed to be changed. Has a little bit of a milkiness into it, so water had gotten into it a little bit too. Not a lot, but some. Now this little engine stand I made is 5 inches by 7 inches, and it's made out of 2x6s, just to hold the vertical shaft, just like that. Oop, had a little gas pour out of there too. The first thing that I'm going to remove is the blower housing, and there's 3 bolts on it that are 3/8, and 1 in the front and 2 in the back. And if you think you're going to have any trouble at all remembering where things go, You might want to take out your cell phone camera and photograph everything as you're doing it, or refer back to this series. Now, a lot of people put their bolts back into the holes that they came out of, or they'll put the parts into a Ziploc bag and label it, or a Dixie cup. You just want to keep everything organized. And I'm going to put it to the side. Next, we're going to remove the air filter, and that's just a flathead screwdriver. Simple enough. Next thing I'm probably going to remove is the spark plug. Next, we're going to be removing the gas tank and the carburetor. And there's only two bolts holding that on. One here and one here. This is a 3/8 inch bolt. We just remove it. And this bolt here is a 1/2 inch bolt. And there's a little hose right here and a hose right here. And it comes apart just like that. Now, our linkage, you might want to take a photograph of this linkage up here. And the gas tank and the carburetor will come off in one piece. I'm going to pour this fuel into an old gas can that I just used for old gas that I'll use maybe to clean parts off later. Next, we're going to remove the weather vane here and the magneto, and that's with 2 1/4 inch bolts right here. Okay, and again, we have to disconnect our governor springs. Now over here, if you remember that brake cable that I was telling you about, what it does is it shorts out. This is a ground that shorts out your magneto. So we just disconnect it right here. And there's your magneto. Next, we're going to remove the brake assembly, and that's 15/16. And there's 2 bolts holding that on, one here and one here. And there we go. And we just released the grounding wire, and it comes up. Continuing on tearing down our engine, we're going to be removing our muffler. And let me show you how an easy way to do that. Sometimes they get stuck, and using a strap wrench makes it a piece of cake. If you're not familiar with these, this is a strap wrench. And a lot of times, for example, when we put our flywheel back on, we're going to have to hold that in place so that we can get the proper torque spec on the nut. It's great for removing cylindrical objects. For example, this muffler. Just put it around it, and then that's all there is to it. In the past, I've had some of these slip because I've got some of these are a rubber strap, but if you just take an inner tube and wrap it around the inside and then around your object, it'll keep the strap from slipping also. By the way, I got this from OTC and it was number 7206. Using a 1/4 inch nut driver, I'm going to remove the pipe that comes off of the carburetor. There's 2 1/4 inch bolts holding that on. The head of the engine is held on by 8 1/2 inch bolts, and when I take them off, just so that I don't distort the head, I always do a alternating removal. And I just take one, I loosen it off, and then I go to the next one, and then I start removing it. I don't take one out all the way. I'll show you what I mean. And I go diagonally, like so. And then since they're all broken, I then use my ratchet. In this particular case, it doesn't matter. All these bolts are going to be the same length. But if they were different lengths, I would maybe mark them some way or put them on a cardboard template that looks identical to this so that I knew which hole which bolt came out of. But like I said, these are all the same length. That would be a good way to lay out your bolts if you wanted to keep track of which hole what came out of. With the head bolts removed, there's a gasket that's tightly sealed on this. If you just give the head a tap with a rubber hammer, it should come off. Next, we're going to be removing the flywheel nut, and it's 15/16. Just like that. When I remove this cover that has the valve springs behind it, this plate right here is also going to come off. It's just 2 1/4 inch bolts. Very simply do that. And as you can see, we got the valve springs behind it. The removal of the flywheel is a little bit tricky because the 2 holes that are in the flywheel aren't tapped. And if you're to use the Briggs & Stratton flywheel puller, this replaces the Briggs & Stratton 19069. This is the Sten's 75015. And interestingly enough, it comes with the 2 bolts that are tapped at the very end so that it'll go into the aluminum flywheel and put a thread in it for you. I haven't had much luck with this, and I haven't had much luck with an inexpensive tap either. So let me show you how I do it. I am against this method you see a lot on the internet, where they'll take a pry bar, jam it in there, and once the bolt is removed, they'll put it just a couple of threads down and hit the top of the crankshaft. Okay, that'll pop the flywheel off. The problem with that is it's rather dangerous. You can break your crankcase doing it. You can damage the threads on your crankshaft. But more importantly, what they don't know is that you could put hairline fractures in this flywheel, and at a later date, it's spinning at high revolutions per minute, it could fly apart and become shrapnel and harm somebody, and they're not even aware of it down the road. All that being said, the way that I do it is I spray WD-40 all over it to break up the rust on the bolts. And you have to do this a lot, not just for an engine teardown, but if they hit something with a mower and it shifts the flywheel, it's going to shear this key that was designed to break. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Okay? And then what I like to do is take an air chisel. I'll put it right in the center of that crankshaft, and then I'll exert some pressure. And I'm not trying to break anything, I'm just, all this vibration is going to pop it up, and you'll see in a minute. There you go. Just like that. I find that the least obtrusive, and when you pull off your flywheel, save your key. A lot of the times our blade adapter doesn't come off that crankshaft very easily, and the easiest way I found to take that off is put your mower blade bolt back in, and using a small gear puller, just put it right on it like so. Just back it off. There we go. Removal of blade adapter. We're going to be removing these valve spring guides here, and you're going to need one of these. Now I've seen people use screwdrivers and pliers, but this is a Briggs & Stratton part number 19063, and it's real. We're going to do an episode just on this valve compressor, but these arms are adjustable to fit our retainer. Let me just show you what we're going to try to do here. We've got a retainer at the end of this spring, and we have to compress it, okay? And the reason for that is there's a keyway in this retainer. You see how that is? In the center, our valve has a recess right here, and when we compress this spring, it's going to allow us to move this to the left and then pop it off. Let's give it a whirl. And once you've got that adjusted, you just come down like this, and it'll make it so much easier to remove and install your springs. All right. Taking our compressor, we're going to wedge it in there, just like so. Okay. And then clamp it down. There you go. See that? Now, what I would do is I would keep this whole assembly, the retainer, the spring, and the valve, and mark it. This is our intake valve, and keep this whole group together and reassemble the engine with all the intake components so we don't confuse them with our exhaust. All right, we're going to be removing the sump cover right here, and you can do this either straight away or you can remove this seal right here. And I find that it works easier for me if I remove the seal first. It'll split it easier, but it will come apart whether you do that or not. A lot of the times when you look underneath your lawnmower, you'll see that a little bit of oil is dripping out of the bottom. It's that seal right here. And I don't have the special tool to remove it, but there is an easy way to do it. You just take a sheetrock screw and you screw into it like so. And now I'm going to pull up on it. Next, we're going to be removing the sump cover. And there's 4 3/8-inch bolts holding this on. Again, I like to go in a diagonal crisscross fashion. That's all there is to it. Now just remove them. There's also 2 more right here. So a total of 6. All right, with that lower sump seal removed, just like that, let's see if we can't separate this. All right, I'll tell you the truth, that didn't come out very well. I kept hitting it with the rubber mallet in the meaty part of the sump cover, and eventually it did break loose. There you go. On the end of the crankshaft is a small gear. Just pull it off and be careful, there's a thin washer right there that we want to keep it with. Okay. Now, when you go to remove your piston, it's always a good idea to put a witness mark right here. And just a simple scratch. Sometimes it can only go on one way. Sometimes it can go on either way, and they want to, the way it came off is the way you want to put it back on. So just put a scratch across both sides of it. And it's just 2 5/16-inch bolts. And sometimes you have to maneuver the crankshaft around to get to them easily. But you can do it. You just pop that right out like so. All right. What I'm going to do is push my piston and connecting rod right on out. Just like so. Now my crankshaft should come right out like that. And the only thing left in this whole engine is this upper seal. And I'm going to pop it out right now just by leveraging it out. The entire engine has been disassembled. We've got the engine entirely taken apart. So let's, real quick, so that we don't get ahead of ourselves, just show the overview of the parts. There are 3 main castings: the crankcase, the sump cover, and the head. Then we have a crankshaft, a flywheel, and a piston. course, we have the muffler. We have two seals that ride on either end of the crankshaft. They, of course, go in the crankcase casting right here. And the sump cover right here. Then we have a gear that fits on our crankshaft. Like so. And that turns our camshaft. The camshaft, as it spins, is going to be lifting up our valve lifters, just like that on these lobes. And as they do that, they'll be compressing and releasing these springs, opening our valves. We also have an oil slinger. Then we have our crankcase breather valve that we discussed yesterday. And of course our piston with our connecting rod. Pretty amazing. Well, this is a 3D representation of our engine that we just took apart. We have the flywheel and the lawnmower blade, again, for the mass to keep this thing going. We have a crankshaft with our piston and our connecting rod. We have a gear here that is half the radius of this gear. This is our camshaft gear. And this is our oil slinger. And the camshaft moves our two tappets, okay, that push up and down our valves right here, allowing fuel into the head and exhaust out of the head. And this is our head with our spark plug. And I know it's very basic, but this is pretty much the internal workings of that engine.